Gentlemen, these diagrams illustrate the future of warfare. Bombers striking cities and factories will shatter the enemy's will to resist.
Bombs away! Direct hits on the factories. Stay with me, boys. Almost home. Gunners report! We need cover!
January 17th, 1940. A pale winter sun hangs low over a windswept airfield in the American Northwest. Frost clings to the concrete runway. Mechanics in thick jackets move quietly between rows of aircraft, their boots crunching against frozen gravel. Most of the planes are small, twin-engine bombers built in another era, machines designed for short missions and short wars. But at the far end of the runway, one aircraft towers above the rest. Its wings stretch wider than any bomber the United States has ever built. For engines sit silent beneath them, their propellers still. Along the fuselage, glass gun positions glint faintly in the morning light. The aircraft looks less like a plane and more like a fortress made of aluminum. Nearby, officers from the United States Army Air Corps watch carefully as engineers perform final checks. At that moment, the United States still has no true strategic air power. No aircraft capable of flying deep across continents to strike an enemy's industrial heart. But the machine waiting on this runway will soon change that. It is called the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, and within a few years, it will carry the war to the skies over Europe. Before that moment arrives, the story begins years earlier, in a world still struggling to understand the power of the bomber. The idea that aircraft could decide wars did not begin with the Second World War. It began in the uneasy decades that followed the First. In 1918, when the guns of the World War I finally fell silent, military planners around the world began studying what the next war might look like. The conflict had introduced tanks, submarines, poison gas, and aircraft to the battlefield. But aviation was still young. Most wartime planes had been fragile wooden machines with limited range and small bomb loads. Yet even during the war, a few thinkers had seen something larger. Among them was the Italian military theorist Giulio de Hette. In the early 1920s, de Hette wrote that future wars would not be decided by armies slowly grinding across trenches. Instead, he argued, fleets of bombers would fly directly over front lines and strike cities, factories, railways, and power plants. By destroying an enemy's industry and breaking civilian morale, a nation could be forced to surrender without a long ground war. Many officers dismissed the idea as extreme, but others listened carefully. In the United States, one of the most vocal supporters of air power was Billy Mitchell. A veteran of the First World War, Mitchell believed that aviation would become the most important military force of the future. During the early 1920s, he staged dramatic demonstrations, even sinking captured warships from the air to prove that aircraft could destroy naval fleets. His arguments were controversial. The American military establishment remained cautious. At the time, aviation was still part of the ground forces operating under the United States Army Air Corps. Funding was limited. Many senior commanders believed aircraft should support ground troops rather than operate independently. But even as these debates continued, the technology itself began to evolve. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, aircraft designers slowly pushed the limits of range, speed, and payload. Engines grew more powerful. Metal airframes began replacing wood and fabric. Navigation instruments improved, allowing pilots to fly longer distances with greater reliability. Still, the bombers of this era had severe limitations. Most were twin-engine aircraft capable of carrying only modest bomb loads. Their defensive armament was weak, often limited to a few machine guns mounted in open positions. Without strong protection, these bombers were vulnerable to interception by fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Their range also remained relatively short. Many military planners believed bombers could strike targets perhaps a few hundred miles from base. Deep penetration attacks against an enemy's industrial centers, thousands of miles away, seemed unrealistic. Meanwhile, events around the world were beginning to prove that air power would play a major role in modern war. In Asia, the expanding military forces of Japan were already experimenting with bombing operations during the early stages of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In Europe, authoritarian regimes were rapidly rebuilding their militaries. Under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, Germany openly violated the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles and created a powerful new air force known as the Luftwaffe. German aircraft factories began producing modern bombers, such as the Heinkel He-111 and the Dornier Do-17. These planes were designed to support fast-moving armored formations in what would later be called Blitzkrieg. In the United States, however, military aviation remained comparatively small. The nation was still recovering from the economic shock of the Great Depression. Defense budgets were limited, and many Americans believed another global war could be avoided. As a result, the bomber force of the Army Air Corps in the early 1930s was modest. Aircraft such as the Martin B-10 represented a significant technological improvement over earlier designs. The B-10 was faster than many fighters of its time and carried an internal bomb bay, which reduced drag. Yet even this aircraft had a range of only about 1,200 miles and carried a relatively small payload. For the advocates of strategic bombing, these limitations posed a serious problem. If bombers were truly going to strike deep into enemy territory, crossing oceans or entire continents, they would need far greater endurance. They would need more engines, stronger airframes, heavier bomb loads, and powerful defensive weapons. Most importantly, they would need to survive long missions without fighter escort. By the early 1930s, a small group of American air power thinkers began imagining such a machine. They envisioned a large four-engine bomber capable of flying higher and farther than anything that existed at the time. It would carry heavy defensive armament in multiple gun positions, allowing formations of bombers to protect themselves against fighters. In theory, this aircraft could fly thousands of miles, reach the industrial heart of an enemy nation, and return safely. At the time, the concept sounded almost impossible. But in 1934, the United States Army Air Corps decided to find out if such an aircraft could actually be built. That decision would soon bring one American company into the center of aviation history. In the summer of 1934, the leadership of the United States Army Air Corps issued a request that quietly challenged the limits of aviation engineering. The requirement was ambitious. The Army wanted a new long-range bomber capable of carrying a substantial bomb load over distances far greater than any existing aircraft. It would need multiple engines, a large fuel capacity, and enough defensive armament to protect itself without fighter escort. At the time, this was an extraordinary request. Most bombers in service around the world still relied on two engines and relatively light construction. A four-engine heavy bomber was seen by many as expensive, complex, and unnecessary. But a few aircraft designers believed the concept was not only possible, it was inevitable. Among them were engineers at the American aircraft manufacturer Boeing. Based in Seattle, Boeing had already built several military aircraft for the Army Air Corps. But when the new bomber competition was announced, the company decided to take an unusually bold approach. Rather than designing a slightly improved bomber, Boeing engineers envisioned something entirely different. Their design, internally known as the Model 299, would be powered by four engines instead of two. The additional power would allow the aircraft to carry more fuel, fly farther, and lift a heavier bomb load. The aircraft would also feature a large all-metal airframe, reflecting the growing shift away from wooden fabric construction. Its wingspan would exceed 100 feet, massive for an aircraft of its time. But perhaps the most striking feature of the new design was its defensive armament. Multiple machine gun positions were placed around the aircraft's fuselage and nose. Gunners would be able to cover nearly every approach angle, creating overlapping fields of fire against attacking fighters. When journalists first saw the aircraft during testing, one reporter reportedly described it as looking like a flying fortress. The name would remain. On July 28, 1935, the prototype aircraft lifted off from Boeing Field near Seattle for its first flight. The aircraft climbed steadily into the sky, powered by 4 radial engines that produced far more thrust than earlier bombers. Test pilots immediately recognized that the plane handled remarkably well for its size. During demonstration flights, the aircraft proved capable of flying farther and faster than the Army had initially required. In many ways, the design seemed to represent the future of long-range bombing. But the program almost ended before it truly began. On October 30th, 1935, during a test flight at Wright Field in Ohio, the prototype Model 299 crashed shortly after takeoff. The aircraft stalled and plunged to the ground, killing 2 crew members. Investigators soon determined that the pilots had forgotten to disengage a critical control lock before takeoff. The accident was not caused by a structural failure or design flaw, but the damage to Boeing's chances in the competition was immediate. Army officials declared the aircraft too complex for regular operation. Instead of awarding Boeing the full production contract, they selected the more conservative twin-engine design built by Douglas Aircraft Company, which became the Douglas B-18BOLO. At first glance, it seemed the 4-engine bomber experiment had failed. Yet some officers within the Army Air Corps were not ready to abandon the concept. The Model 299 had demonstrated something extraordinary during its brief testing period. It had flown farther, faster, and higher than competing aircraft. Its defensive armament was far superior to anything currently in service. Even the crash itself revealed something important. The aircraft was not too dangerous to fly. It was simply more complex than earlier bombers. Pilots would need better procedures to operate it safely. In response, Army pilots developed one of aviation's most important innovations, the pre-flight checklist. Step-by-step procedures ensured that critical controls and systems were verified before every flight. With these new safety practices in place, the Army quietly ordered a small number of improved aircraft based on Boeing's design. These early versions became known as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Production remained limited at first. In the late 1930s, the United States was still officially neutral in the growing global crisis. But the world beyond American shores was rapidly descending into war. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering the beginning of the World War II in Europe. The conflict quickly spread across the continent as the German military unleashed fast-moving armored and air attacks against neighboring countries. As the war intensified, the need for long-range bombers became increasingly clear. Factories, railways, and fuel depots deep inside enemy territory were proving to be crucial targets. Destroying them could cripple an entire war economy. By the time the United States began expanding its military in the early 1940s, the B-17 was already in production. What had once been an experimental aircraft was about to become the backbone of America's strategic bombing campaign. And when the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Flying Fortress would soon face its greatest test. High above the skies of occupied Europe, the theory of strategic air power would finally collide with reality. The B-17 was not just another bomber. It was a statement of industrial ambition and military foresight. for engines produced enough power to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles. Unthinkable for most aircraft in the 1930s. Its all-metal airframe gave it durability unmatched by earlier wooden or mixed construction planes. Defensive firepower was revolutionary. Multiple machine gun positions, nose, tail, dorsal, ventral, and waist, allowed gunners to cover nearly every angle of attack. Each gunner had a field of vision designed to overlap with others, creating interlocking zones of fire. Enemy fighters could no longer approach unchallenged. The aircraft itself became a fortress in the sky. High-altitude performance was another game-changer. The B-17 could operate at 25,000 feet, above the reach of most anti-aircraft guns of the era. In combination with its speed and defensive armament, it promised survivability on missions that would have been suicidal for earlier bombers. Navigational technology, still primitive by modern standards, was optimized for long flights over hostile territory. Bombardiers relied on early versions of the Norden bombsight, a device that promised unprecedented precision for daylight attacks. Accuracy, long believed impossible from high altitude, was now theoretically achievable. The aircraft's complexity was staggering. Hundreds of moving parts, sophisticated fuel systems, and redundant controls required highly trained crews. Operating the B-17 demanded discipline and coordination on a scale that no earlier bomber had asked of its pilots, navigators, or gunners. For the men who would crew the flying fortress, technology was only part of the story. Life inside a B-17 was grueling, claustrophobic, and dangerous. A standard crew numbered 10: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 5 gunners. Space was tight. Moving between positions required careful coordination. At high altitude, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Oxygen masks were mandatory above 12,000 feet. Frostbite was a constant threat. Missions could last 8 hours or more, flying over enemy territory where every shadow could hide an anti-aircraft gun or an enemy fighter. Crews learned to rely on each other for survival. Trust was not abstract. It was a matter of life and death. A single distracted gunner or missed engine check could cost the aircraft and every man aboard. Fear was ever present, but so was a strange camaraderie. Letters home describe shared cigarettes, whispered jokes, and silent prayers. Pilots called it the tin coffin syndrome, knowing the plane might not return, yet climbing aboard day after day. The B-17 was central to a new American vision of warfare, daylight precision bombing. Military planners believed that industrial targets could be destroyed from high altitude, crippling enemy economies and shortening wars. Commanders such as Haywood S. Hansel and Carl Spaatz championed this approach. Unlike the British, who relied heavily on nighttime area bombing, the United States Army Air Forces sought to hit factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs with surgical accuracy in daylight hours. Formation flying became both a tactic and a necessity. Tight box formations allowed gunners on different aircraft to cover each other, creating overlapping fields of fire. This combat box tactic maximized defensive capability while maintaining bombing accuracy. The doctrine required enormous coordination. Groups of 30, 50, or even 100 B-17s had to maintain precise altitude, heading, and spacing over long distances. Any deviation could result in gaps that enemy fighters would exploit at high altitude. Daylight bombing demanded skill, courage, and relentless discipline. It was a strategy that relied as much on human endurance as on technological superiority. From the moment American B-17s began appearing over European skies, the Luftwaffe took notice. These aircraft were unlike anything they had faced in earlier conflicts. Heavier, faster, and bristling with defensive guns, the Flying Fortress demanded a new approach. German fighter pilots quickly learned that attacking a single B-17 in isolation was a deadly gamble. Concentrated fire from waist gunners, tail gunners, and dorsal positions could shred aircraft before they closed in. Pilots were instructed to attack in coordinated groups, often from head-on angles where the B-17's defensive coverage was weaker. Anti-aircraft artillery, flak, also became a primary threat. German gunners developed intense, overlapping barges along anticipated bomber routes. High-altitude formations were particularly vulnerable when flying predictable paths to industrial targets. Each mission tested both sides' tactical creativity and courage. The Luftwaffe's respect for the aircraft grew quickly, and in many ways, the B-17 forced a transformation in German air defense doctrine. Fighter deployment, radar coordination, and anti-aircraft strategies all evolved in response to the American threat. The B-17 was not just a machine. It was a product of American industrial ambition. Its production involved multiple factories across the United States, coordinated to unprecedented scale. Boeing's Seattle plant built the early series of bombers, but as demand increased, additional factories joined: Douglas in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Lockheed Vega in Burbank, California. Thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled wings, fuselages, engines, and gun turrets. Rivets, panels, and instruments flowed along assembly lines like clockwork. By 1943, production was so rapid that the U.S. could replace losses faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy aircraft in combat. This industrial capacity became a strategic weapon in itself. The B-17 was not just a bomber. It was a symbol of the United States' ability to outproduce any adversary. This massive industrial output also meant continuous improvements. Later models carried heavier bomb loads, more powerful engines, and additional defensive armament. Feedback from combat missions was integrated directly into production, ensuring that the aircraft evolved alongside the demands of the battlefield. For both the crew and those on the ground, the B-17 carried an unmistakable psychological weight. In occupied Europe, civilians and enemy soldiers alike reported fear and awe at the appearance of bomber formations crossing the sky. Hundreds of aluminum aircraft in tight formations, moving with deliberate precision, could darken the horizon and rattle even seasoned defenders. For American crews, the psychological burden was equally intense. Knowing the high probability of casualties, facing flak and fighters over hostile territory, and enduring the cold and exhaustion at high altitude created stress that no training alone could erase. Yet the shared purpose of each mission forged extraordinary resilience. Even within the enemy ranks, the B-17's reputation grew. Luftwaffe reports and intelligence analyses emphasized that these aircraft were extremely difficult to destroy and capable of sustaining multiple hits while still completing missions. Pilots often described them as fortresses in the sky, a nickname the Americans themselves had embraced. By the summer of 1942, the United States had formally entered the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had transformed a nation that had once hesitated into one mobilized for total conflict. In Europe, Germany had already conquered Poland, France, Norway, and much of Western Europe. Britain clung to survival, its cities battered by Luftwaffe raids, while the continent's industrial heart beat under strict Nazi control. For the American Army Air Forces, the Flying Fortress was now ready for combat. The first missions would not be ceremonial. They would be tests of endurance, courage, and doctrine, stretching both men and machine to their limits. In mid-1942, small formations of B-17s were dispatched from bases in England under the newly formed 8th Air Force. The early sorties focused on occupied France, targeting factories, airfields, and rail yards critical to the German war effort. At first, the Americans sent modest groups, sometimes as few as a dozen bombers per mission. The goal was not only destruction, but also gathering vital intelligence on German defensive tactics. From the outset, the B-17 crews encountered the brutal realities of combat. High above the French countryside, they faced fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Anti-aircraft artillery, flak, ranged from small-caliber guns that rattled fuselage panels to 88mm batteries capable of tearing wings apart. For many crews, the first mission was a baptism of fire. Despite these dangers, the B-17 proved remarkably resilient. Multiple accounts describe aircraft returning with large sections of tail or wing missing, engines on fire, or gunners wounded, yet still capable of completing their mission and landing safely. These stories spread quickly through bomber crews, forming an almost legendary reputation for survivability. Daylight bombing, however, carried enormous risk. Enemy fighters were adept at concentrating their attacks. The 8th Air Force discovered early that lone bombers were highly vulnerable. Even in small formations, pilots had to maintain strict discipline, flying precise headings and altitudes to ensure mutual protection. Any deviation could expose gaps that the Luftwaffe would exploit. During these early missions, commanders like Haywood S. Hansel and Carl Spaatz observed the need for larger, more coordinated formations. They began refining the combat box formation, a tightly structured, staggered arrangement of bombers that maximized overlapping fields of fire. It was a solution born of necessity, crafted from the lessons of blood and iron. The aircraft's technological advantages were evident, but they did not guarantee victory. Bombing accuracy remained inconsistent. The Norden bomb sight, though advanced, was still subject to weather, wind, and human error. High-altitude winds could scatter bombs across miles, sometimes striking unintended targets. The crews quickly realized that hitting a factory from 25,000 feet was an art as much as a science. Nevertheless, the combination of formation discipline, heavy defensive armament, and altitude endurance allowed the B-17 to survive missions that would have been impossible for earlier bombers. Each sortie produced invaluable lessons: optimal bomb release points, evasive maneuvers under fighter attack, and techniques to minimize flak damage. The first extended missions were also revealing for the Americans' industrial advantage. Early losses were devastating, yet quickly replaced by new aircraft rolling off the production lines. Unlike Germany, which struggled to replace aircraft lost in combat, the U.S. could absorb attrition while maintaining operational tempo. By late 1942, the Flying Fortress had demonstrated that the concept of strategic bombing, long-range, daylight precision attacks, was feasible. Still, the air war over Europe was escalating. Early successes in France were minor compared to the objectives that would soon confront the Americans, the heavily defended industrial centers of Germany itself. The B-17 had passed its first test. It had proven capable, formidable, and resilient. But the ultimate trial, the mission that would define the effectiveness of strategic air power, was still ahead. High above the Ruhr Valley, deep inside enemy territory, the Flying Fortress would soon meet its greatest adversary: concentrated Luftwaffe fighter opposition and the deadly wall of flak guarding the industrial heart of the Third Reich. It was here, in the skies over Germany, that the true cost of strategic bombing would be revealed. And in this crucible, the Flying Fortress would either justify decades of planning and industrial effort, or pay a price that would haunt every surviving crew member. October 14th, 1943, dawned gray and bitter over England. From airfields scattered across East Anglia, formations of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress began taxiing on a frost-lined runways. Engines roared to life, propellers slicing through the chill, as crews prepared for one of the most ambitious and perilous missions in American military history. The target, the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, deep in the heart of the German industrial zone. These factories were crucial to the German war machine. Without ball bearings, tanks, aircraft, and artillery could grind to a halt. The intelligence was clear: destroy Schweinfurt, and the Third Reich's war effort would falter. Nearly 300 B-17s lifted off in tight formations, their silhouettes dark against the overcast sky. Each bomber carried its maximum bomb load. 10 men crowded into each fuselage, aware that every mission had a grim probability of loss. Crews shared tense silence, punctuated by clipped orders over the radio, the hum of engines, and the occasional cough from the thin, cold air at 25,000 feet. For the Americans, this mission represented a test of everything: aircraft design, formation discipline, bombing accuracy, and sheer human endurance. But the Luftwaffe was waiting. Intelligence had predicted the strike, and German commanders concentrated fighter wings along the anticipated route. Over the Netherlands, the first attacks began. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 swarmed the bomber formations, approaching from head-on, from above, and from below. Despite the overlapping fields of fire, B-17s were hit. Engines caught fire, wings were shredded, and gunners fell silent, victims of enemy bullets. The defensive machine guns could protect only so much. One by one, bombers began to falter, spiraling earthward. The second layer of danger awaited over Germany itself: flak. Over Schweinfurt, dense concentrations of anti-aircraft artillery opened up a latticework of steel and fire. Hundreds of rounds erupted toward the high-flying formations, turning the sky into a deadly storm. Shrapnel tore into fuselages, puncturing fuel tanks and shredding rudders. Crews reported deafening concussions and the smell of scorched metal. Despite the chaos, the Americans pressed on. Formation discipline and pre-mission planning allowed the bombers to reach their target. Bomb bays opened, and thousands of pounds of explosives were released over the factories. Some targets were hit precisely, others scattered by wind or evasive maneuvers. Smoke and fire rose from the industrial zone, visible even from the high altitude at which the bombers operated. But the cost was staggering. Of the 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 were lost, nearly 1 in 5. Many more returned heavily damaged, barely capable of landing. Crews that had trained for months now counted their friends among the dead or missing. Letters home would describe it simply: Black Thursday. The losses shook the 8th Air Force to its core. Commanders convened emergency meetings, analyzing why the aircraft, so robust and technologically advanced, had suffered such attrition. Lessons emerged quickly. Daylight precision bombing was possible, but only with long-range fighter escorts to suppress enemy fighters. Tactics had to evolve. Flak routes had to be studied and avoided when possible. Formation discipline had to be even more rigid. Out of this crucible came resilience. The United States accelerated production of B-17s and, more importantly, developed the long-range escort fighter, the North American P-51 Mustang. These fighters could accompany the bombers deep into enemy territory, reducing losses and giving crews a fighting chance to return. Psychologically, the mission had a dual effect. For American crews, the horrors of Black Thursday forged a grim determination. They understood the cost of strategic bombing, yet also recognized its potential. For the Germans, the sheer audacity of the mission, the ability of the Americans to reach the heart of their industrial empire despite losses, was a warning. The B-17 could not be ignored. The Schweinfurt raid marked the first major turning point in the American strategic bombing campaign. It revealed the vulnerabilities of the flying fortress, but also its promise. Survivors returned with tales of courage, endurance, and the cold logic of industrialized warfare. Lessons learned over those brutal hours would shape every subsequent mission over Europe, laying the foundation for the eventual crippling of the German war economy. By the end of 1943, The Flying Fortress had proven that long-range strategic bombing was no longer theoretical. It was reality. The skies over Europe had become a deadly proving ground where technology, human will, and industrial might collided. And in the aftermath of Black Thursday, the B-17 emerged, not unscathed, but unmistakably central to the Allied strategy of total war. The stage was now set for the consequences of this new air power. The destruction of German industry, the evolution of Allied tactics, and the rise of the United States as a dominant force in the skies. By early 1944, the consequences of the American bombing campaign over Europe were becoming clear. The Flying Fortress, once a prototype sitting silently on a runway in the Pacific Northwest, had transformed into a weapon capable of reaching deep into enemy territory. Its impact was not immediate nor total, but it was undeniable. The attacks on industrial targets, factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and rail hubs began to strain the German war economy. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, despite heavy fortifications, had suffered repeated damage. Production slowed, forcing German engineers to improvise repairs under dangerous conditions. Other industrial cities faced similar pressure. The 8th Air Force's precision bombing raids forced the Germans to disperse facilities, build decoy factories, and invest heavily in anti-aircraft defenses. The United States Army Air Forces had learned painful lessons. Each mission cost lives, yet every sortie provided critical intelligence and feedback. Crews returned with detailed observations on flak concentrations, enemy fighter tactics, and the performance limits of their aircraft. Commanders used this information to refine bombing altitudes, formation patterns, and evasive maneuvers. The B-17s themselves became symbols of resilience. Reports from the front lines circulated widely among crews. Aircraft returning with entire sections of fuselage missing, with gunners wounded or dead, yet still able to land safely. These accounts reinforced confidence in the aircraft's durability and its ability to withstand punishment that would have destroyed earlier bombers. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe adapted to the challenge, concentrating their fighters along anticipated bomber routes. Flak defenses grew in sophistication and intensity, creating deadly corridors over key industrial regions. German intelligence meticulously studied bomber patterns, attempting to predict their approach and maximize destruction. Yet America's industrial power proved decisive. Unlike Germany, which could replace aircraft and crews only slowly, U.S. factories produced B-17s at an extraordinary rate. Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed Vega, and other manufacturers combined to create hundreds of bombers each month. Losses in the air were replaced almost immediately, allowing the strategic campaign to continue uninterrupted. The psychological impact on both sides was equally significant. For American crews, each mission reinforced a harsh reality. Survival depended on strict discipline, formation integrity, and mutual reliance. Fear and exhaustion were constants, but so was a growing sense of purpose. Each bomb dropped on the industrial heart of Germany was a tangible contribution to a larger strategy, a strike aimed at hastening the end of the war. For the Germans, the presence of the Flying Fortress forced adaptations that consumed valuable resources. Anti-aircraft batteries were redeployed, fighter wings shifted, and civilian workers were pressed into repairing damaged factories. The B-17s did not merely destroy material targets. They forced the enemy to react, stretching their defenses thin and creating vulnerabilities elsewhere. By late 1943, the strategic bombing campaign had reached a turning point. The combination of durable aircraft, disciplined crews, evolving tactics, and overwhelming industrial support allowed the Allies to maintain pressure on Germany's war machine. The B-17 was no longer experimental. It was central to the emerging doctrine of strategic air power, a tool capable of shaping the course of modern warfare. The lessons of these missions would resonate far beyond the immediate conflict. Precision bombing, formation tactics, and the integration of technology with human skill became foundational principles for air forces around the world. And as the war moved into 1944, the B-17 would continue to fly deep into hostile skies, carrying the fight closer to the German industrial heart and setting the stage for the final chapters of the air war. By 1944, the B-17 was no longer a solitary symbol of American ingenuity. It was the backbone of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. Production had surged to unprecedented levels. By the war's end, more than 12,700 B-17s had been built, each one a testament to the combined power of American industry, engineering, and logistics. Factories operated around the clock, employing thousands of men and women, many of whom had never worked in aviation before the war. Every rivet, panel, and engine represented a direct contribution to the war effort, a tangible link between the home front and the front lines over Europe. The success of the B-17 also spurred innovation in related fields. Long-range navigation, bombing accuracy, and formation tactics evolved rapidly in response to combat experience. The aircraft itself underwent continual improvements. Later variants carried heavier bomb loads, additional gun positions, and more powerful engines, adapting to the increasing sophistication of German air defenses. Combat experience fed directly back into design and production, creating a cycle of refinement that kept the B-17 relevant throughout the war. Perhaps the most critical development was the integration of long-range fighter escorts. Early missions had shown the vulnerabilities of even the most advanced bomber formations. The introduction of the North American P-51 Mustang, capable of accompanying bombers all the way to deep German territory, dramatically reduced losses and increased mission success rates. The combination of durable B-17s and escort fighters established the foundation for a sustained daylight bombing campaign, which would eventually cripple German industrial capacity. The B-17's influence extended beyond the war itself. It validated the doctrine of strategic bombing and shaped post-war military planning. The lessons learned informed the development of the next generation of heavy bombers, including the B-29 Superfortress, which would later carry the war across the vast distances of the Pacific. American air power, once considered secondary to armies and navies, had now achieved strategic relevance on a global scale. The human toll remained profound. Thousands of crewmen had been killed or captured. Entire units were decimated on missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Yet the endurance and courage displayed by these men reinforced the reputation of the Flying Fortress as both a machine and a symbol, resilient, relentless, and capable of carrying the weight of a nation's war effort. By war's end, the B-17 had not only contributed materially to the Allied victory, but had also transformed the understanding of air power itself. No longer merely a support arm for ground forces, strategic bombing had emerged as a decisive tool in modern warfare. It demonstrated that industrial capacity, technological innovation, disciplined training, and human courage could converge to strike deep into an enemy's heart and influence the course of history. The Flying Fortress had survived its trial by fire. Its missions had tested every element of air combat doctrine, production capability, and human resilience. And in doing so, it had established the United States as a force capable of projecting strategic air power across the globe, an enduring legacy that would shape military thought for decades to come. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is more than the tale of an aircraft. It is a reflection of human ambition, industrial might, and the evolution of warfare. From a risky prototype sitting on a frozen runway in 1935 to hundreds of bombers crossing the skies over Germany, the B-17 became a tangible embodiment of strategic vision realized. It proved that a single aircraft, when combined with disciplined crews, rigorous tactics, and industrial support, could alter the dynamics of war. The Flying Fortress taught painful lessons. The cost in lives was immense, and every sortie demanded courage that few could truly comprehend. Yet it also demonstrated resilience. The aircraft could sustain damage, endure the fiercest defenses, and return to fight again. Strategically, the B-17 changed the way nations thought about air power. Long-range bombing shifted from theory to practice, proving that the industrial and psychological cores of a nation could be targeted from the sky. It forced both allies and enemies to adapt, shaping doctrines, technologies, and military planning long after the war ended. There is a human dimension that numbers and statistics cannot capture. The crews who climbed aboard the Flying Fortress, knowing the odds of survival, embodied a blend of courage, discipline, and determination that defined the American contribution to the air war in Europe. Their efforts ensured that the war reached the heart of enemy territory, hastening the collapse of a war machine that had once seemed invincible. In the quiet of the post-war years, the B-17 stands as a symbol of ingenuity, endurance, and the profound impact of strategic thinking. It is a reminder that technological achievement alone is never enough. Success requires coordination, courage, and the relentless will to see an idea through under the harshest conditions. The Flying Fortress carried more than bombs. It carried a nation's ambition, a vision of modern warfare, and a message that air power could, indeed, reach across continents and reshape the destiny of nations. From its first tentative flight to its triumphs and trials over enemy skies, the B-17 secured a place not only in history, but in the very imagination of what air power could achieve. The age of the fortress in the sky had begun, and with it, a new chapter in warfare that would echo for generations.